Salut tout le monde. Moi, je suis Carlos. Aujourd'hui, je parlerai en anglais parce que j'ai mis confiance en mon français. Je peux me débrouiller, mais je ne peux pas soutenir vraiment une conversation académique en français. Donc, la préférence pour l'anglais. Today, I will be delivering a paper which I've titled The Inimical Gaze, Morality and the Reproduction of Sociality in Amazon. This paper is actually, it's a finished chapter, actually will be coming out in a book edited by James Laidlaw in one of those handbooks published by Cambridge University Press. This one is a handbook on morality and anthropology of morality and ethics. The task I got when he recruited me to write for this volume was to discuss societies in which relations of otherness or of alterity are understood to be definite and distinctive kinds of social relations with particular ethical significance, and in which enemies are a constitutive feature of the social and moral landscape. So, enmity and its place in the understandings and lives of particular societies. I am an Amazonianist, so no doubt that was one of the reasons he chose me, was because I would be speaking about lowland South American societies where there has been considerable investment of time and effort in writing about relationships of enmity. So I'll begin by telling you about a time when I was about to go fishing with some friends among people of the center. These are people in the Caquetá River in the Colombian Amazon. And I reached hastily underneath a beached canoe, and when I pulled it out, a fish hook went through my finger. I think it was this one. Yeah, I still have a little scar. And my host, the owner of the house where I was staying, was mortified. He felt he was responsible for my well-being while I was in his house. So that night he licked some tobacco paste to be illuminated by it and diagnosed the situation. And the conclusion was that nobody had warned the fish hook the night before when we licked tobacco and expressed what our plans for the following day were going to be. We hadn't warned the fish hook that I would be picking it up to go fishing. It didn't expect it. It angrily attacked me. It was incensed and offended and attacked me. So what's interesting there is that in people of the center semiotic ideology, the cosmos is populated by these subjectivities and intentionalities, thoroughly imbued by subjectivities and intentionalities. Hooks subjected people to the gaze, if you will. As miscreants, it looked upon me angrily, questioning my ethics. Yeah, so back to why I'm bringing this up. It's common among South American Indians to treat alterity as a matter of fundamental concern. They understand the self to be constituted in and by a process of relating to others, including fish hooks and enemies. My claim is that relations of alterity are a feature of a widespread and enduring pattern, an Amazonian package, I call it. Also, that morality, loosely, the proclivity of human beings to evaluate in terms of socially developed distinctions of worth, what goes on in their world, plays a causal role in the reproduction of that package. I will define that package later on. Let's turn up to that concept of the gaze, and just an accident that happened when Laidlaw asked me to write this article. I that day or the day after, I was sitting waiting for a haircut, and I found this article in a hairstyles magazine, the tackiest magazine. With, I mean, the cover is all about coiffures and things like that. There was this fantastic article on film and film theory and feminism and the male gaze, and it was a serendipitous discovery. It discussed how in the mid 70s, it addressed mid 70s discussions of the male gaze in film, where shot, reverse shot, you know, that technique, well, a certain style of filming taught viewers how to interpret what they saw. People learned to see scenes in a certain way. And they learned to watch movies from a male perspective, where the story was not the woman's, but rather women were the mirror of men's story, their men's morality, their motives, their emotions, and so forth. And the way this was done, one of the techniques was the shot, reverse shot. So they'll show a man looking. Then they play with the camera and film a woman. And it conveys to us who have learned to see film that way, the idea that that is what the man is looking at, that woman. And then it hangs around the woman's body, kind of creepy actually, sort of focusing on the curvaceous parts of her body. There might be suggestive music as well. And then it goes back to the man. These cinematic portrayals of gazing men elicited certain attitudes from both men and women and helped reproduce certain constitutive understandings of what men and women were and should be. Men were invited to be manly by joining other men in looking at women in a certain way. And the assumption was that looking at women in that fashion was truly an expression of manliness. That is how men are. That is what a man does. That's how you perform your masculinity. Women were invited to embody the looks and behaviors that such men looked at. The assumption being that such features and behaviors defined admirable femininity. The psychoanalytic idea behind that concept of the gaze is that others gaze and otherwise engage with us with certain expectations and evaluative attitudes and standards. Living our lives among others, we take some of their expressions to be about us. They're looking at us in a certain way. Living among those others, we develop a sense of the kinds of beings we can be, that we should be. We understand our relationships with others on the basis of their gaze, or how we interpret the gaze. So understandings of self, this is part of the psychoanalytic, romantic, semiotic take on self. Understandings of self, our understanding of who we are, is to some extent constitutive of who we are. It makes us a certain kind of person. The gaze is interpreted. We creatively attribute evaluative attitudes to others on the basis of semiotic forms that they deploy or that we impute. I define semiotic forms, you might find this familiar, as sensible material forms that we associate with other forms to make meaning. That's that concept of a web that you find in Geertz and Saussure in Christos. But we're including among the material forms the sensible forms in question, such things as tone of voice of a direct verbal interpolation, kisses, rolling eyes, the giving of an expensive gift, burning a cross in front of somebody's house, wearing a facial veil or sending a happy face icon, narratives, spoken injunctions, innumerable other genres and forms. Also places, objects, smell, tactile and proprioceptive sensations, other icons and indexes in our understandings and memories. So it's big. So out of ongoing conversations going on around us, we pick up semiotic forms that we use to achieve our own selfhood. Some of the most interesting work in that regard has concentrated on gender in the urban West, actually. Before being born, there was this expectation from others that we would be either a boy or a girl, and that then, as we were children and grew up, others evaluated the gender appropriateness of our actions. Our sense of who we are, a man, a woman, a non-binary person, an abject gay monster, dependent on how and the extent to which we catch on to such expectations and evaluations, interpret them, and internalize them. So our understanding of whether we are an admirable, normal gay person or an abject monster is to some extent dependent on how and the extent to which we catch on to expectations and evaluations from the conversations around us, how we interpret them and internalize them. And that's a process over which we don't personally have a clairvoyant view. That there's an opaqueness to persons. We don't fully understand the semiotic events that come to provide us with semiotic elements that make us who we are. The process of internalization is imperfect. It features infelicities, contrarian relationships to expectations and evaluations. You are well familiar with that, I am sure. So let's talk a little bit about language and the attribution of minds to others. I will get back to Amazonian, I promise. The gaze always involves linguistic articulations. I am channeling Charles Taylor, the philosopher there. Language is a necessary structuring element among the semiotic deployments that constitute us persons. I might not garner full agreement from you on that, but we might agree that one linguistic resource available to most of humanity for the attributions of minds to others, and specifically of attitudes towards and evaluations of oneself, is the possibility of quoting or purporting to quote others and animating their voices in reconstructed dialogues. Yeah, the possibility of quoting or purporting to quote others and animating their voices in reconstructed dialogues. That's the resource, right? The others can be consociates, siblings, family, bosses, friends, etc. But they can be ontologically distant gods, future descendants, a literary circle, past dead authors we have read, pets, imagined Facebook readers. These are others to whom we attribute a gaze on us, a perception of us. In Amazonia, fishhooks and distant kin and in-laws and enemies and dead ancestors and plants and animals and tools, songs, spirits, animal owners are among the others to whom Amazonian people attribute states of mind and a gaze on people, a way of looking at people and evaluating people. In Amazonia, there are diverse genres that do this. Songs are fairly big. Songs that express understandings of relationships with humans and non-human persons. So Andrea Luz Choquevilca has a great paper from 2016 about that. Cernella wrote a paper on a coteria woman, an unhappily celibate coteria woman in the Valpes, whose song animates the voices of sisters and male cousins speaking about her. And it's a really complex strategy where sometimes the woman is singing about what they are saying when they are quoting the woman herself. So there's this nesting process there. And Christine Taylor has written about Hibaron and Annette that interpolate an absent addressee to modulate their relational dispositions towards the singer. And these addressees can be cultigens, game animals, pets, kinsfolk, lovers, the dead, artifacts, other Annette. And what this does is it makes them remain in the singer's memory and be efficacious. There's a nice one where a man sings an Annette that says to a woman that he wants to have sex with, I think. She's way downriver, and he's singing into her awareness. It is I who, like a setting sun, am causing you to swoon. So he's causing her to imagine him, and he's as magnificent as a setting sun, and she swoons with desire for him. Oakdale, Suzanne Oakdale, who worked with Akayabi in the Xingu, describes a man's Jawosi song, in which he animates the voice of an enemy he killed. And the dead man says that he tried to offer the killer, who is the singer, right? He tried to offer the killer food and to cause the killer to forget him, but to no avail. And so what the singer achieves there is to portray himself as resistant to the other's attempts to change his mind, his decision to kill him. What I garner from Taylor, whom I use a lot, is that it is necessary for people to have certain narratives or other linguistic resources at hand to be who they and others imagine them to be. To be a certain kind of person, you need a certain linguistic resources, semiotic resources. Taylor captures this nicely. He says, if we are partly constituted by our self-understanding, and this in turn can be very different according to the various languages which articulate for us a background of distinctions of worth, then language does not only serve to depict ourselves in the world, it also helps constitute our lives. Certain ways of being, of feeling, of relating to each other are only possible given certain linguistic resources. Without a certain articulation of oneself and of the highest, it is neither possible to be a Christian ascetic, nor to feel that combination of one's own lack of worth and high calling, nor to be part of, say, a monastic order. Linguistic and other semiotic resources can be used strategically, as Goffman would have said in his treatment of impression management. We can use the tools at hand for strategic purposes, to persuade others that we're a certain kind of person, or that we have certain intentions, let's say. But strategies concern more fundamental debates. But strategies concern more fundamental beliefs about which people aren't strategic. When we try to persuade people that we're a certain kind of person or a certain kind of being, we might not pass, and we might not be convinced ourselves, but we tend not to question that that kind of person really exists, nor that they feature certain admired characteristics. I might try to be a macho man, for instance, and pretend to be that. And I might be strategic and not persuade people, not even be persuaded that I am that kind of man. But the idea that that kind of man really exists is not something that I would normally question. It's something that deeply persuades me. Does that make sense? And we can take it to, you can go to different levels. At some level, people are really persuaded that they are a certain kind of Let's move on to this topic of morality and the inimical gaze, specifically among people of the center. Um, so they have linguistic resources, semiotic resources to portray others' gaze, right? And there was a striking self-portrayal by a Ritoto man whom I'll call Marcos. And the story goes, we were sitting in a coca circle. Marcos came in. Marcos was a nice guy, liked by everybody, not particularly of high status as a man of knowledge. But this time around, he told us a story about how a few decades before, when he was still young, but already a mambiador, already he was already an adult, people were dying. And everybody knew that there was witchcraft going on, but nobody knew who it was. And just recently, his uncle Octavio, his classificatory uncle Octavio, had died. Anyway, he decided that he was going to investigate the matter. This is him telling us the story. So he investigated the matter with his mother. He had his mother make yahe, ayahuasca, drank it. Ayahuasca for them has the virtue of making the world and time transparent. You can see reality, what actually happened, what the causes of diseases are inside people's bodies, and who caused the problem. And so in an ugly, ugly, scary trance, which he was very manly and overcame, he finally cut through the nasty part and was revealed to the world. And he saw his uncle in the coca circle, Octavio. And Octavio saw him and said, "It is you? A mere orphan? Great men, great sages have tried to discover who it was that was doing the sorcery, and I got away with it. Nobody ever discovered me. And here you, a mere orphan, comes and finds me." Ah. So he was putting words in his dead uncle's mouth. He animated the tone of voice of the dead uncle, such that the frustration and grudging acknowledgement of Marco's knowledge came through. The emotional qualities that Marcos expressed underscored for others, for us, a certain moral import of the circumstances, right? He was making a case that this entailed something, right? Basically, that Marcos was, despite appearances, admirably knowledgeable. And yeah, so doubtless he was being strategic, right? Having another speak admiringly of him, even if he's the one actually saying it's the other, animating the other's voice, it still to some extent appears that it's the other speaking. Even if it's an evil old man. Right? Aristotle said that we believe good men more fully and more readily, but the social psychologist Aronson told us that we, at least his urban research subjects, can believe miscreants too, as long as it is clear that they have nothing to gain from persuading us. So the storyline was strategic. Yahya reveals everything normally, but then savvy sorcerers can escape that incisive gaze. So it takes somebody with great esoteric abilities to find out those sorcerers. Then he was also using the image of the orphan. Orphans are supposed to be low prestige because they're bereft of kin and unprotected. And yet they often appear in stories as people who acquire great knowledge while doing menial jobs. Now, so what I'm saying is the people of the center are strategic in their self-presentations. They take great pains to ward out particular inferences about their thoughts that others might form. So I'm talking about gazes and attributing gazes to others and trying to modulate others' gazes here. His story depended on certain metaphysical and moral premises. They all, the people present, more or less accepted that we lived in a transformative universe populated by spirits and sorcerers and other subjects endowed with intentions. That in the universe, certain esoteric capacities were necessary and admirable, and that those capacities were not often things of use. My sense was that Marcos and other people at the center deeply and unquestioningly desired to be men of esoteric knowledge. Or at least they saw that that way of being was unquestionably possible. In the relational understanding of personhood that I'm rehearsing here, the gaze shapes not only mental states, but bodies themselves. That duality of bodies and minds is something that we want to give up. And indigenous peoples, for the most part, don't share it. Many Amazonian peoples converge in the understanding that what a person is a question of the body. What species you are is a question of the body, but also what character features you have, such as whether you're stingy or stupid or wise or quick to anger and so forth. All that is about having a body that is that way. And bodies are mutable. They are the mutable processual product of ongoing social relations between persons. A great deal has been said, and I'm sure at the EPHE you have heard about that often, about the genesis, fabrication, transformation, destruction of bodies, and the roles of eating, drinking, body painting, dress, substance consumption, among the semiotic deployments through which individuals create and maintain or transform and end relationships. I particularly like, there's an article by Beth Conklin and Lynn Morgan from 1996 that is fantastic in that regard, very clear. The idioms of shared bodily substance are common as well. The substances are blood, semen, milk, chicha, manioc bread. For people of the center, tobacco is key. And tobacco makes up the body. But the tobacco sounds through our flesh. It is our flesh, makes up our flesh, and it sounds through our flesh to create our thoughts and emotions and attitudes and memories. Tobacco is species specific, it is language group specific, it is clan and lineage specific. So I witnessed people, for instance, talking to their kin and protesting. Why do you think differently? Why do you not agree with me? Why are we speaking differently if we're supposed to be made of the same tobacco? Our tobacco is supposed to speak in the same way to us. So there's supposed to be both a consubstantiality with tobacco and a like-mindedness that results from that like-bodiedness. We have the same kind of body with the same tobacco. We should think the same thing. How can you possibly disagree with me? That basically means you're not a real person. Some false tobacco has usurped your proper subjectivity. Having said that, even as they push the sameness of consubstantial bodies, the idea that tobacco constitutes body also serves to push individuality, right? They recognize individuality, right? The fact that my brother and I have the same tobacco or made up of the same tobacco doesn't mean we should be behaving in the same way. Our tobacco does not say the same things to him as it does to us. What to do. It sometimes pushes us in different directions. I'll skip a little bit just to be faster. A few years ago, as of about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I coined a term. I called it the Amazonian package to encapsulate a pattern of semiotic articulations. A pattern in semiotic articulations widespread in the region, comprising 3 sets of claims and other formulations to the effect that, first element, persons, and most importantly persons' bodies, are fabricated in and through social relations, as described above, and in other ways. In many Amazonian accounts, social groups are created by fashioning like-bodied persons who are competently sociable, and by the same token, social life largely concerns the creation of such like-bodied persons. The second element is that the process of making persons takes place in a cosmos in which each sentient being, plants, animals, meteorological phenomena, tools, other entities, perceives itself and others with bodies like its own as human, and bodies different from its own as animals or other non-human beings. That's a lot of the Vedas that cast those perspectives. And third, persons need, in order to produce and reproduce their bodies and those of kin, relations with a panoply of others who differ from them in bodily constitution and operations. So that's the alterity that is supposed to be the core of this paper I'm giving. In perspectival cosmologies, beings are easily subject to unwitting bodily transformations, to become a different kind of being, a different kind of person, even a different species, without realizing it. That's always a danger, because you will not witness it. You might not be aware that this has happened. And so this gives a certain urgency to the making of bodies and to the fixing of bodies, the fixing of perspectives. And yeah, it's, again, well studied. The collective work of fabricating the bodies of kin and one's own body is also about ensuring a common perspective, often the most fundamental of moral tasks. This is tied to shamanism. Of course, shamans can change bodies, navigate perspectives. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. There's an analogy between the formative capacity of the gaze as we theorize it in the West, in psychoanalysis, in film, and the like, and native accounts of perspectivism. Perspectives differ and sometimes clash. For instance, from the perspective of parasitical worms chewing on my intestines, they are human and my intestines are manioc bread. But from my perspective, that's my guts and they are vile parasites. And so sometimes our perspectives clash in a life-threatening fashion. If they are right, if I really am manioc bread, I die. Or if my perspective wins over, I survive and they die. They can't eat anymore because that is not manioc bread. That is a human's guts and that's not edible. So there's clashes that cause one nature to hold sway, to win over the other. People of the center really value the capacity to overcome the transformative capacity of others' perception. It's a case of gaze upon gaze. Whose gaze is the strongest? And yeah, I use the term package because I think the case is made that there are pattern resemblances and differences among cosmologies, mythologies, and other sociological features of many Amerindian peoples. The concept of the package is not all that original, really, but spread and duration of the package beg for causal explanations. And mine is kind of novel for the region. I claim that many indigenous American peoples have constructed over time motivating pictures of an admirable person and the good life, scaffolded by accounts and understandings of relational and embodied personhood in perspectival cosmos suffused with alterity. Motivated by these pictures, people have gone about their lives behaving as humans do, evaluatively, and their evaluative deployments have more or less conservatively reproduced the elements of the package by more or less felicitously interpolating members of new generations. The process is not teleological or infallible. I am not talking about a structural straitjacket here. It's not irresistible, it's not deterministic. It's widespread, but not necessarily found everywhere. And where it can be recognized, the elements differ somewhat from what they appear elsewhere. and this is what's to be expected if we accept the idea that consociates co-construct their social lives and the imaginative cosmos within which such lives occur on the basis of pattern deployments of semiotic forms. And if we take such forms necessarily to be material and thus subject to the vicissitudes of local histories and personal biographies. So let's move on to a greater focus on that third element, that necessary alterity. That's the third element of my package. Many societies in lowlands of America maintain that relations with beings different from them are necessary for survival, for well-being, for reproduction. These others are part of these continua of alterity, from beings that are very close, very similar to us and just a little bit different, to beings that are along this spectrum, really, really distant and other. And so we go from very siblings who are just a little bit different from us, from the individual person, to distant gods and to, well, in-laws whom you can marry, to enemies whom you can't marry, to enemies whom you have to kill, to animals, to plants, to gods and spirits and the dead. The spectrum of alterity differs between societies. There have been some very interesting debates in lowland South Americanist anthropology about that, how best to formulate these relations of alterity. I will skip a chunk of that debate and return to a part of it later. But yeah, interesting about it, for instance, relationships, how these are conceived, these relations of alterity. Relationships between hunters and game animals are sometimes treated as comparable to relationships of affinity, right? Remember that spectrum of alterity. Affines, people you can marry, they are outers, they are others, different from you, and you need them to have children. You also have relationships with animals, or owners of animals, spirit owners of animals, and the relationship between human affines is sometimes likened to relationships with animal game. For instance, the process of hunting might be treated as a process of seduction, like you would seduce a human spouse, you need to seduce game. And as you would negotiate with a father-in-law, you need to negotiate with the fathers of animals or the owners of animals. But again, there's so much difference. There's a lot of difference in lowland South America and how this is understood. In some cases, this is deemed a benevolent process. Killing an animal is allowing it to reproduce. That happens with the desana. Among the Wari, wild pigs are the incarnation of dead ancestors who lovingly, willingly, and generously give up their new fleshy bodies to surviving kin to eat. So there's this positive providentialism. Among people of the center, the relationship is much more inimical. It's vindictive, it's nasty. You trick animals, you kill them, they get nothing in return. Another good example of the need for others is Pieroa, who you have these gods who were crazy and cannibalistic and out of control, and they have these crystal boxes. And so the shaman goes to these crystal boxes of the gods and takes out forces and puts them carefully piecemeal into persons. And they are absolutely necessary for young persons to be able to live competent social lives, to be able to hunt, to be able to weave, to be able to have children. These are creative capacities taken from the gods. But they're very dangerous and can kill people if they're not carefully controlled. So they're necessary and dangerous. So that's a particularly clear example there. So my argument, if I can take you back to the concept of a package, the third element is that relationships of ulterior are unnecessary. The elements of the package, I claim, provided motivating ideals. I keep going back to that idea of motivation and morality, of evaluative sense that drives people, that motivates people. The package provided motivating ideals of how people ought to live, and it constituted the background against which admirable ways of life made sense. The analytical focus on the moral dimensions suggests that causal underdetermining explanation of reproduction of the atoms in the package. So bear with me. I've told this story in different ways. I have to tell it again. So tobacco made humanity. It constitutes human flesh. It speaks through human flesh, constituting attitudes and emotions and thoughts and habits and awareness and memory. But remember, tobacco is another. It's a plant and a cooked substance. It's a creator God, and it's a very powerful predator. When somebody is misbehaving or anguished or has troubles, at times an elder or a fellow in the coca circle will instruct them. Look into your own body. And it's like it's a little bit like the Greek, in English, know thyself. Noscete ipsum. Look at your own body, know thyself. It's a call for a reflexive, critical, inward gaze. That's the gaze of the tobacco out of which the person's body was fashioned. It's a morally discerning and calm gaze, and yet it's predatory. So you turn your calm, ethical, predatory gaze into yourself to figure out which element of your behaviors and emotions and so forth is not working. So the need for the ferocious inward gaze is because non-human participation in embodied human subjectivity is a condition of subjectivity. I mean, our subjectivity, our phenomenology, our attitudes, emotions, thoughts, etc., all come from an outside source, tobacco. Sorry, not all. It turns out that subjectivity, our thoughts and emotions and so forth, can be taken over by animalistic substances, animal tobaccos. So this is important to their moral evaluations, right? This comes up not in abstract talk, but in people screaming at each other about each other's thoughts and emotions being really human or not, and in gossip about whether another person's body is well made and truly human or not. They explicitly evaluate thoughts and emotions as either being truly a person's own and admirable, stemming from their embodied lineage-specific tobacco, or else as spurious because they were generated by nasty false tobaccos and other substances that animals or sorcerers cause to speak through people's bodies. They also keep talking about how well made their body is. Oh, my body's set properly when I was a young man, and that is why I work so quickly and efficaciously. No laziness, no dilly-dallying, I'm efficacious. And that's because that's the way my body's set when I was young. And people are braggarts about this, very immodest from our perspective. So people of the center were concerned about the likelihood of not being fully aware of the sources and nature of their own thoughts. Because one of the tricky aspects of subjectivity is that a false subjectivity can sound through you and it still feels real. It still feels authentic. Like my great anger or my great jealousy when looking at my wife talking to another man, it could be the righteous anger of my tobacco realizing that something is wrong, or it could be an animal tobacco inside me, ruining my moral subjectivity, making me lose sight of propriety and of what proper emotions are, and making me suspicious and stupid and so forth. So people's their narratives about personal and social tribulations, including diseases but also emotional strife, involved a sense of an inseparably moral and ontological struggle between formative, indeed determining gazes or perspectives. Yeah. So again, there's that example of gut parasites. And to heal them, a man must lick tobacco, and then you speak about the origins of gut parasites and so forth, and you address the gut parasites as filthy, disgusting creatures. How dare you touch a real human being? And that tobacco-empowered speech is supposed to elicit shame in the gut parasites, and then they die. So this story is one of the many discursive and non-discursive semiotic deployments that together contribute to shaping people's sense of what is human and inhuman, morally good and morally despicable, a sense and a sensitivity that was a part of their own evaluative gaze. People of the center's versions of perspectivism were strong in the sense that they were intimately felt. People really felt that their own perspective was mutable, and they were very worried about it, very morally concerned about it. But it's not radically perspectival, so I use strong and radical differently. It's strong because it's very intimately felt. It's not radical because they don't do the multinaturalist thing where there's no ultimate right perspective. People of the center do claim that the human perspective is the ultimate ethical, moral, and right perspective, and the one that, under normal circumstances, imposes itself on all others. There's one myth. Why do I want to tell it to you? I need to write this down. One myth is about a mother who would leave her child alone at home and she went to garden. And so the child was left alone. And animals, which have human form, as is typical of perspectival cosmologies, would come and they would take care of him. But they would take care of him in a travesty of childcare. Remember, animals have a human perspective, but they do everything wrong in an immoral fashion. And one of the things they're doing is they're shaping the child's body and thereby the child's emotions. So they would wrap a carrying blanket around the child, but where the proper human carrying blanket is a comforting thing, this one made the child itchy and uncomfortable and angry. And then they would tell the animal to hit them. They would give him little sticks and say, hit us. They would put their hands in its mouth and tell him, bite me. They were eliciting his desire and eliciting his embodied penchant to hit, to be angry, to be itchy and obsessed. The body is the Foucauldian ethical substance par excellence. It's the part of the self that is the object of thought and work in people of the center's efforts at fashioning themselves and others. But it's also the great vulnerability as inimical beings can make changes to bodies and thereby to attitudes and behaviors. In terms of the gaze, animals looked at the animals in that story looked at the child with malevolence and hate. and carried out with him a caricature of acts that shaped children in a way that elicited from the child the gaze, attitudes, and behaviors of animals, which are immoral. In everyday life, children and adolescents witnessed and came to participate in situations in which people fretted over the constitution of kinspeople's bodies, they bragged about their own bodily and affective consistency, and they condemned the poor makeup of others. So people witnessed this constant, morally evaluative interacting in terms, really, of the Amazonian package. The element, those semiotic elements were being used to interpolate them in morally evaluative fashion. Okay, let me move to the final long section of my lecture, my talk today, and it concerns the reproducing bodies, reproducing cosmologies, reproducing relations. Viveros de Castro, in deep analysis of 16th century Tupinamba sociality, argued that Tupinamba society was constituted as an ongoing relationship to the enemy, a relationship anterior and superior to society's relationship to itself. So, the Tupinamba were nothing. They are a disaggregated group, but then in relating to a dangerous enemy together, that's what makes them a society. That relationship to the other. Without the other, there would be no society. But that is a relationship. It's an inimical relationship of mutual cannibalism. And it is tied ideologically to an existential need for revenge, preceded and motivated by particular attacks. Each instance where you kill an enemy and eat him was but a step in a cycle of vengeance where they had taken one of your people and eaten them. So homicide was institutionalized as a condition for man to achieve full status as a man. What cannibals consumed and absorbed was first and foremost the perspective of an enemy. In other words, for society to continue to be, some people had to come to see, to have the perspective of an other, and a cannibal other, in order to keep the whole of society going. Now, my argument was that this begged for one more step. So I buy it, but it needed another step. And this is me with my obsession with morality, my Taylorian obsession with morality coming in. As an account of vengefulness, as an emotional motivation that played a causal role in historical processes. It calls for attention to the reproduction in time of the semiotic conditions of that motivation. One risk with not doing that is you're naturalizing vengeance. You're basically supposing that the emotions surrounding vengeance are the same all over the world. Their imports, how it is felt, how it's perceived, and that I don't buy. That I don't buy. With Charles Taylor, I think emotions are import attributing conditions. That is, emotions attribute to the situations that elicit them certain characteristics that pertain to the desires or purposes of the self. I will give you a prosaic example. I'm sorry, I wrote this one for undergraduate students, so yeah, it's a gross example. But the deep embarrassment that somebody might feel about accidentally farting in public is likely tied to the sense that the situation suggests to others that one lacks bodily control or a grasp of etiquette. But to be embarrassed in that way depends on one aspiring to be a certain kind of subject. Dignified in presence, where dignity includes control over one's body, and where one attributes to others sensitivity to dignity and sensitivity to manifestations of lack of control. Only then can somebody feel that kind of embarrassment. It's when one is attributing that kind of import to the circumstances, and when one aspires to a certain picture, to a certain image of the controlled, dignified person. So a condition of such emotions is that one have in place certain desires or aspirations. They're all part of a sense of what it is to be a good or admirable person. So for the vengeful young Tupinamba, his emotions would have attributed certain imports to a killing of a kinsperson. He would have thought that it placed him in a position of losing honor or of substance if he didn't respond properly, or of becoming a full-fledged adult of proven courage if he did respond properly. Anger was likely inflected by anguish and excitement, perhaps a sense of duty or expectation. These are all conditional on participants understanding the situation in terms of semiotic webs that articulated and gave evaluative accents to the nature and virtues of persons, to the nature of death and of kinship and relations with others. And it's the conservative reproduction of these webs that needs to be explained if we are to give credence to the claim that vengeance was an intergenerational driver of Tupinamba society. Listen, we can feel vengeful, but you can be pretty sure that the meaning of vengeance, of revenge, is not the same for us as for them. The meaning, the experience, the imports, the desirability or lack of desirability of it, it's not the same. We can recognize some commonalities, but there are other associations around vengeance that are semiotic, reproduced socially, picked up from conversations and so forth. So I treat that as a version of the third element of the Amazonian package, that need for the other, need to kill the other, need for vengeance of the other. And so the same question regarding the conservative reproduction of semiotic webs applies generally to this element and to the Amazonian package. How to account for its spread and presumable duration? This is kind of like the spread and duration of recognizable transformed myths in the Amazon, according to Levi-Strauss via Pete Gao. People of the center cited elements of the package in their moral self-portrayals, in their critical gossip, their myths, their dance rituals, the counsels of children in emotional outbursts. My interpretation is that this interpolated persons, telling them what kinds of beings they were or could be or should be, and motivating them to act in ways that reproduced these elements. Numerous convergences with other Amazonian peoples. I saw numerous convergences with other peoples. Hence, I hazarded the thesis that the package was widespread and durable, and that the spread and durability were tied to its historically contingent, but nonetheless constitutive role in shaping morally evaluative, motivating pictures of what it is to be a human being, and a good and admirable one at that. It seems likely to me that people have used its elements to articulate their visions of the good, and frames with which to determine in time what was good, valuable, ought to be done, ought to be opposed. Amazonians' understandings of bodies, perspectives, and alterity feature in qualitative distinctions of worth that stand out in their horizons of concern. Lots of the rigmarole around making bodies, very common in Amazonia, is about making good bodies, knowledgeable bodies, tough bodies, tranquil bodies, bitter or sweet or consistent or consubstantial with each other, always morally inflected. Frequently, there's this existential moral preoccupation in perspectival cosmos with whether things are what they appear to be, even whether you and your thoughts are what they appear to be to you. So The flip side of that, there's great interest and moral concern with fixing bodies, with trying to make sure and to make the claim to others that your body really is the kind of body that you claim it is, that it is truly a human body and not easily mutable into something else. You want to make sure people are consistent. Look at the case of the Hebaro Adutan search. There's this interiorized other that shares with the man the certain knowledge of a future event in which the man will kill an enemy. In terms of the gaze, the man attributes to an interiorized, terrifying soul, vision, an image of his own future self as an effective killer. And that gives him consistency. And it obviates fragility. Among people at the center, well, they claim that bodies are made of this infallible predatory tobacco, which is the source of moral thoughts and emotions. And they constantly claim to be human in constitution, to be fixed, consistent, and consistently with moral acumen. I witnessed different interpolating events, like 2 little girls were being yelled at by their grandmother. Stay away from your grandfather, he has a jaguar inside him. He has a jaguar tobacco. Stay away, he'll make you sick. The little girls, however they took it, they might not have understood well, but they felt fear. They moved away, like, terrified and in shock. You can see this kind of interpolation over time, making it likely that they would conceive the possibility that their own thoughts and emotions could be taken over by jaguars, and that this was that dangerous, scary situation. So what is manifest, what is picked up by others and reproduced is semiotic forms. When they're put out there in association with others, they're often picked up together, and this patterning gives us culture commonality. But there's Derridian difference, slippages between the associations that shape the meanings of our deployments. Even the desire to have one's children experience the same desires one has is subject to symbolic mediation and difference, and is under nobody's clairvoyant control. What the kid will pick up in association with these desires that one has will be inflected by new associations. So the process of reproduction of motivating pictures of selfhood is not teleological. Human intentions and meaningful actions have historical effects, but in the long term, these effects do not necessarily align with the logic of a person's intentions. In other words, if we accept that the human will is itself in part semiotically constituted, then the reproduction over time in semiotic forms is what is in question. And it cannot be assumed that certain forms are reproduced in the long term because individuals will it so. I'm still vexed by what makes some semiotic forms and associations less mutable. The answer is historical. You could ask the same question about a language. Why is this language I am speaking, these noises I'm making, why would you recognize similar noises in Jamaica and South Africa and the United States and England and in Shakespeare and in works written 200 years ago in Australia? And the reason is historical. But what makes certain things, certain semiotic forms change? Languages don't last more than 500 or 1,000 years. They change to the point where they're unrecognizable, don't they? In 500 to 800 years or 1,000 years. Buddhism lasted 5,000 years, 3,000 years, I don't know, something like that. The story of a man killed and hung on a cross and being the child of a god, how long has that lasted? So what makes certain stories last and be spread? The answer is historical, but there might be some features to the semiotic forms. Like, I think once a web of semiotic forms is established, regarding, say, bodies, well, maybe there's something about bodies as semiotic forms that makes them harder to change. Bodies are fairly consistent. They're born small, they grow, they die, they rot. Maybe that gives semiotic webs in which bodies are a node a little bit more resistant to change. Not imperfectly resistant, but, and so that's why that aspect of the package may have been reproduced fairly conservatively. Keane has this idea that he uses social psychology, and he says intention seeking or mind reading has been shown, if you buy into the kind of psychology that he cites, that it's a human universal, innate intention seeking or mind reading. We attribute mind to others. And he says, well, maybe the way to treat this is as an affordance. Everybody has it, but it's just an affordance that a society can develop culturally, come up with really great stories about it, and run with it. It's available for people to pay evaluative attention to and develop, or not to. So in Amazonian perspectival cosmologies, and you have these existential doubts regarding the perspectives of self and of others. And that's as morally charged in Amazonia as opacity doctrines are elsewhere. And that could profitably be thought of as a historical semiotic development of possibilities afforded by the human tendency of human beings to attribute intentions to others. That innate tendency may constitute yet another causal influence on the relative consistency and conservatism of the Amazonian package. And I will leave it at that.